Good afternoon and welcome. I'm James Puther. I'm the chair of the board. I'm only going to say a few words, which is what you see behind you here, this building, is truly a picture of inspired activity that actually shows itself in something then that will make such a place for people who are working to reclaim their lives, to have a place to do it, accompanied side by side with those who are surrounding them with activities, surrounding them with love, and at the same time giving them an opportunity to make that choice for themselves of what they want to do with their lives. And you'll have a chance after these brief comments from our various speakers to have a chance to look inside, and I hope you'll make a point of doing that as well. When you see what a space can be like to support this healing process, it's quite something. I'd like just briefly just to say that I want to thank my fellow board members who have been as volunteers coming. We've been meeting on a monthly and sometimes more often basis in order to actually create a way to kind of think through the support that this place has generated. It's very much a matter of the inspiration of Beatrice Birch, who you'll get a chance to hear from as well. And I think one can recognize that the kind of activity, the kind of work that goes into a place like this, and you'll see once you see this building, everything has been thought through with an eye towards creating, as I said, a space in which people really can take hold of their lives again, many of whom have struggled for a long time, but have made this choice. And to be able to support that has been one of the things that we've worked so hard to bring about. So I'm not going to say anything more. I'd like to just ask our board members if they would just to stand just for a minute, just to recognize you, if you would. All right. Thank you. And just to give you kind of a picture of what's brought this about in terms of the actual flow of the donations that have made this possible, I'm going to ask Tom Cavett if he'd come up and just share a little bit about what that is.
I'm the treasurer of the board at Interfire, and it's remarkable to see the progress that's been made over the years with this. But this facility was built entirely with donations, so everything that you're seeing has been with donated money. Interfire is a nonprofit, and it's just hundreds and hundreds of people, many of whom include you folks in the audience today, who've helped by in innumerable ways, both financially and otherwise. We've raised more than $1 million. About $300,000 has gone for financial assistance for people who couldn't afford to come to Interfire, and about $800,000 has gone to this first stage of the development, all of the site work, the building, the septic system, all this sort of stuff that's a part of the whole thing. There are a couple other buildings. There'll be one right behind you there, one right over here, and an arts and drama barn back over there that we're still fundraising for. But it's beautiful to see it happening, and it's only because of the generosity of people like you. And I just want to express my gratitude and that of the entire board for all the help we've gotten from all of you for so long. And with that, I'll turn it over to Beatrice.
You know, life every day is totally different here at Interfire. I used to sort of think, will there ever be any continuity? And I realized, just stop expecting that, you know. And so life is very busy here, and so really, this is a moment to pause and to look and to see what has happened. And it's really, you know, have you all ever had the experience, has anyone here ever had the experience where you suddenly realize what has to happen? You don't know how it's going to happen, but it's got to happen, and in fact, it is going to happen. And all you have to do is say yes. And you have to therefore trust. What happened about 9 years ago, I was working at a rehab, where as a Hauschka artistic therapist and as a consultant, and suddenly it was like a setup. Suddenly I had, maybe there were like 7 or 8 people, residents, came into me, stood right in front of me, and said, I hate being medicated. Isn't there a choice? And I knew it was a choice. I practiced in Europe in clinics where we never medicated anybody. And I would tell them about Robert Whitaker's book, The Anatomy of an Epidemic, about madinamerica.org, and I'd give them places to, yes, there are choices. And then 4 of them left this rehab, and I heard within 2 years they had taken their life. And I had recently heard of 2 other people, one happened to be a cousin of mine, who also took his life because they hated being disconnected from their clarity of thinking, their heartfelt feelings, and their ability to do anything and to make a difference. And that's, when you think about it, this thinking, feeling, doing, it has to do with being a human being. We're only partially human if we don't feel, and if we can't think clearly. But these psychotropic meds disconnect us from that. So people are living a zombie-type life existence. And when this happened, I thought, I'm out of this, to be honest. That's really my first, I can't handle this. When I know there's a choice, and people are taking their lives because they don't know, and then I thought, no. Instead, you find your colleagues and you offer a choice. And my best colleague was Tom. So sorry. And so we began, and we started looking for a place where this could happen. And then I remember saying one day, well, what are we going to call the people who come here? I don't want to call them patients or clients or residents. And then I remembered a wonderful young man named Ian, who I knew when I was working in a prison in New York State. And he came to me one day and he said, I was painting with him. He said, I was trying to write to a friend on the outside about this art class. And it's so hard to describe what happens here. Eventually I told my friend, it's an art class, but it's really a spiritual class. And then he looked me straight in the eyes and he said, this is what I was looking for on the outside. Isn't it strange I had to come to prison to find it? And I thought, you all are seekers. You're all looking for something more than this fast-paced, superficial, materialistic life. And so I said to Tom, we call them seekers. So when a young man came in one day wanting to come to Inner Fire in our first year, he sat down and he says, he gives me his name, but he says, I'm schizoid affective, and so. And I say, I'm not interested in your label. I'm much more interested in who you are as a person. And in fact, everyone I know who's wrestling with what's called schizophrenia has some untold story. That's what it's about. It's about when we have problems, which who here in this room has never had a problem in life? Yeah. And once, if we're lucky if we have someone who will stop and listen to us, if we can have someone to talk to. But so quickly nowadays, you're just medicated. You're bipolar and you need this. And typically one medication leads to another. We have to, and then Robert will talk more about this, but we have to realize that this is a cultural thing. I'm concerned about the individuals. I remember once thinking or saying to you, Robert, you do the big stuff. I want to work one-on-one with individuals. But when we know, apparently 4 out of, well, a huge, I'm no good with numbers, but a huge number of people are on antidepressants nowadays. And why are they still on them? They don't work, actually. How many people know someone is on an antidepressant and it's working? right? But you get a good. Okay, there's some. So what we do at Inner Fire is we help people to either avoid medication in the first place, taper slowly, slowly, carefully off medication, or deal with the withdrawal symptoms of having been medicated, right? While helping to strengthen them on a deeper soul spiritual level. Yeah, you can't just come off the meds because all the ghosts are waiting there in the closet and they're going to get you because we need to become whole. We need to digest and work through our traumas, integrate them so we're a whole human being. And if we can begin to see challenges as opportunities for growth, that's what gives us a dynamic life. It's a hellish, hard life at times, but it's real, you know? And so, let me see, just to have a look. Oh, well, I wanted to go, if I can just jump to, well, I'll mention this, that, you know, so the mission of Inner Fire, we are a proactive healing community offering people the choice to recover from debilitating and traumatic life experiences, which typically can lead to addiction or mental health issues, without the use of psychotropic meds. And I would even argue about this term, mental health. You know, even though the head sits on the shoulders, we are a whole organism, yeah? Our head, our mental condition is affected by our soul. So I think one of the greatest challenges today is the view of the human being, and we talked about this earlier, Christopher. The human being has a body, a soul, and a spirit. And the spirit is that part of us, and I hope we all have experienced that, is never hurt. It's never damaged. Our soul gets all sorts of wounds, and we have to work and to breathe with that. And then we have our physical body. Yeah. So the whole program at Inner Fire, which makes it unique, is we recognize the human being as a whole, not just a head, not just mental health issues. And that's why one of the key things is rhythm. To build up what some people might recognize as the etheric body, the rhythm body, and that they know they have to be up at 6 because breakfast is at 7. And then they know at 7:30 we're washing up and we go for a walk at 8 and we come back at 8:30 for our morning circle, which 2 days we have out in the woods. So we build a fire in snow, which is pretty cool. Yeah. And then otherwise in the hearth room at the Gracebrook is where we do the our morning circle, where we share how we're doing and what we're grateful for. That what we're grateful for is really important when you're tapering to remember. And then, you know, we're proactive in the sense that when you leave Inner Fire, you will know how to cook properly. The diet is incredibly important. We work with a GAPS type diet where there's no sugar. It's high fat, high protein. We use kimchi. We make kimchi from the gardens, and I hope you'll have a look down there. Kimchi, sauerkraut, yogurt, kefir. We get raw milk. It's all organic. It's a 7-star restaurant, but you're the cook. And you leave knowing how to cook. You also have learned how to chop down a tree with an axe, right? 2-person saw it, split the wood, and actually I've had people who hear voices tell me, when I split wood, I don't hear voices. And many of them feel they're going to be haunted by voices the rest of their life. But they realize when I put my energy, when I get out of my head into my limbs and I split, I'm freer of that. And we have that time and time again with people, and it's like, really? You know? And then of course they stack the wood, and they know that they are creating this for the future seekers to come. Yeah. So in the mornings we work in the outdoors. We do, it's sort of, I see it as breathing. We breathe out into the community, we give. And I'm needed. If I don't turn up and help Susan with the cooking, she's gonna have to do it all by herself. So feeling of being needed, feeling of doing, I'm getting out of myself to do for the community. So that's the out breath. And that's so important. Then in the afternoon, after the midday meal, and 3 days of the week, we do a liver compress to help strengthen the liver so it can do its job. And we also have an infrared sauna to help with the detoxing. Then they do the different artistic therapies. So we have music therapy, we have eurythmy, we have spatial dynamics. And Marguerite in the back has brought that to us in the past. We have rhythmical massage. I still do the artistic therapy. I do not want to be on the road traveling all the time and lose touch with what's happening here. And then in the evenings, we have extraordinary evenings where you sit in a circle together and you share what you appreciate about everyone in the circle and yourself. And then we have sharing the question, we have singing and all sorts. So it's a comprehensive program that taps in to all parts of oneself, you know. And so I think James just gave me the nod, thank you. But I would just like to say that we have Idel here who teaches stained glass. During the time here, the people go and work with a blacksmith, with a glass blower, who I was hoping they would be here, but I don't see they are. But Idel has come, and when you go into the hearth, into the east wing, you'll see these arch windows. They have the stained glass which the seekers have made. So again, it's getting them out of their heads, which is really the theme, into your will, and explore the feelings. And we have, just to mention this, we have anger is okay, but violence is unacceptable policy. We all have anger in us. We all have the whole spectrum of emotions in us. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not is different, but we're capable of doing anything. Anyone out there we want to point our finger at does. Yeah? And the whole idea is to claim, if you can see anger as blocked creative energy. It's energy that should be flowing, but it's blocked because we don't do that here, or whatever it is, you know. And so I just want to finish with, it dawned on me, this is a quote that I've had in my home, but suddenly I realized that this is pretty much what it's about, how this happened. And it's a quote by Goethe, and it goes this way: until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and material assistance, which no man could have dreamed would have come his way. Whatever you can do or dream, you can begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Begin it now. And I can vouch for that, because there are times where I've gone to sleep with real questions. How are we going to do this? And in the morning, I get a phone call. I tell you, it is magic. And you just have to go, and there's no certainty. You've got to trust. You have to know it's needed, it's right, and you go for it. So, as you can tell, I could probably go on for hours, but I'm going to stop and pass it on to Robert. And Robert, it's such a gift. Robert was first here in December 2013 when we had our celebratory launch. It was in the winter. And he's been, I have felt him sort of quietly there, watching, observing, and it's been a tremendous support. And I'm so grateful for what you've also done for so many other people by helping them to claim their voice through your books. Yeah, they're not alone. Thank you.
I have to say, first of all, it's such a pleasure being here. I first met Tom and Beatrice when 2011. You were still at the rehab place. And people often have dreams. And they say, we want to start a place. And I say, oh yeah, okay, that's nice. But it's a long way from a dream to a reality. And so there was the dream. And then 2013, I was here. Yeah. And okay, they had a place, beautiful place. But I have to say, is this my first time back?
Yeah.
It's so transformed. I hardly realized I was in the same place. But they also had a dream at that time. We stood on the road, if you remember, and you said, and up there, we're going to build a house. And the house comes. So I just want to say, for everyone involved, it is really inspiring to watch something come from a tiny nugget of an idea with a sense of making a better place and actually having it come to fruition. You really should be so proud of yourselves. It's such an amazing achievement. It really is. And the place is fantastic. I mean, beautiful. Here's what I want to do real quickly, is sort of look at why is inner fire important in a larger scheme of things. When we look at the larger story, the larger system of care we have, why are people paying attention to inner fire, and what is the possibility here? What moment in sort of history and in the history of psychiatric care are we at? And why is, I think, inner fire at such a pivotal place in that history? If you go back a long time ago to 1792, was a moment of a seed for a paradigm shift in caring for, quote, the mad in Western countries. And it came from Quakers in York, England. Now, prior to this time, or at this time, the prevailing thought was the mad, I'm using the language of the time, by virtue of having lost their reason, had descended to a lower level of being, like they were like animals in essence. Because reason at this time was seen as the faculty that separated humans from animals. So with that conception, there were all sorts of harsh treatments. In fact, when the first hospital in the United States opened, or in the colonies opened, they kept the mad in the basement along with other animals. They just gave them straw. They thought they were impervious to heat and cold. You look in the medical textbooks, they whipped them in order to instill fear in the same way you would tame animals, okay? So that was the prevailing conception. That was what was taught in medical schools. That was the advanced thinking. And then the Quakers in York, England, rebelled against that. And one reason they rebelled against it, they had one of their members who went to Bedlam in the UK and died there. The person was chained up. And they said, we want to think of a different way. Now, who are the Quakers? Well, first of all, the Quakers were a group that were really outside the power structure of England at this time. But what was so central to being a Quaker? How do they worship? They worship in circles, right? There's not this hierarchy. And so they had this conception. They reconceived of the mad. They said, here's what we know. They're children of God. Now, obviously, whether you're religious or not now, this is a framework for thinking at the time, of course. They're children of God, and as children of God, what are they? They're brethren. They're not the other. They're not the animals, but they're brethren. They are us. They are like us. So how should we treat brethren? Well, we should try to give them a shelter. We should try to give them good food. The only difference, I think, in terms of the food element is they had a glass of sherry or porter at about 3 in the afternoon. I'm just saying. 3 good meals, a little bit of sherry. Okay. So it was, and they said, now remember, if you would have gone to the Philadelphia hospital, they were in the beginning, they were kept in straw, in the basement. They actually would have Philadelphia people come out, pay a couple pence to look at the crazy people, like you went to a zoo. But here at the York Asylum, they said, as brethren, we want them to dress like us. In other words, so you couldn't see the difference. They thought nature was healing, good food was healing, exercise was healing. And as part of this reconception, they said they have first of all, a God-given capacity to reclaim their sanity. So they saw this as a thing of hope. They weren't lost human beings. Something had happened, but they had this God-given capacity to recover, to get back into be able to be with others. So I already mentioned exercise, etc. They would read, they would have poetry, and this whole thing of creating an environment that helped nurture people. And the caregivers in the York Asylum had two thoughts. So we need to be gentle with people, because if you're gentle, you're not going to get violence in return. And actually, they had very little violence at the York Asylum. By the way, it still exists today. And then the second thing was this. We believe many people can recover and can go back and out into the community. But if they can't, our obligation still remains to them to provide a decent place. So there was this double sense. We can help people get well. And if some people still can't be out in the world, our obligation to brethren is to provide food, shelter, relationships, comfort, that sort of thing. Now, if you follow history of psychiatry, and if you look at outcomes, because the York group, they formed something called the York Retreat. It opens in 1796. And they start measuring what happens to the first, in essence, they get two groups when they open. They get one group that has been in hospital, okay, sort of a chronic group, and then they get first episode patients. And they start looking what happens to their people newly psychotic, newly coming to the asylum. And what do they find? And you had to be quite, in the language of the day, you had to be quite crazy to get into an asylum in 1796, okay? You had to have a really difficult time being in society. Well, within 12 months, about 2/3 would be released and able to go back out into the society. So all of a sudden, they saw people who could lose their sanity, so to speak, and with the right environment, a good percentage actually could then recover and go on with their life. Okay. Now, that's the best recovery rate that we still have today. It's never been equaled. Oh, and by the way, this actually gets, the Quakers then, it begins in the UK, and then Quakers introduce it into the United States as well. McLean's Hospital was all the first sort of asylums that we sort of remember, the Hartford Retreat, McLean Hospital in Boston. These were Quaker organized based on this moral therapy principle. And it became the therapy of the day for about 45, 50 years. And the idea was you would try to keep them small. They said the insane had a very good appreciation. They needed to go out walks. They also had a very fine appreciation of architecture, their surroundings. So the whole idea was you would build these nurturing environments. And believe it or not, in the United States, if you look at some of the first, initially they were private, okay? And then a woman named Dorothea Dix, in around 1850, she has her own break. She's a Massachusetts woman. She goes to the York Retreat in the UK, gets healed, comes back and says, why don't we have this in the United States for public health patients or people, the poor? And she goes around saying, like, this is how the mad are cared for in many places. They're chained to trees or treated badly. She says, we need to build retreats like they have in York, England. This really was the first big public, sort of public health project ever in the United States, was building moral therapy asylums. And when they adhered to the original blueprint, they were successful. If you go back, scholars have gone back and looked at the people that entered those first episode patients, and then looked at how they were doing 5 years out and 10 years out. The best such study was done in Worcester asylums. About 2/3 would be discharged within 12 months. And at the end, if you take 100 people, first episode, say that enter Worcester Asylum in 1845, crazy, insane, etc., 30 years later, about 2/3 were functioning outside in the community. We don't have anything like that today. Now what happened was, real quickly, is once they built these facilities, they were supposed to be small, about 250 people. You were supposed to have relationships with the people who work there. The community started dumping everybody into these facilities, people with syphilis, end-stage, older people with dementia. And then once you start using them as nursing homes and dumping grounds, they grew up into these huge facilities. People stopped getting well, and we lost the memory, the institutional memory, the historical memory that people could get well from very difficult places with environment. And really what they were saying was, what do we all need to be well? Well, food helps, being in nature helps, and they had this idea. This is key to this. The original person who founded this said this: we need to reflect back to the people, not an image. So I'm let's say I'm a staff. I need to reflect back at the person, not an image of a crazy person. In other words, what do you see of yourself in my eyes? But rather a person who can be in society. In other words, be a mirror for others that shows people at their best. Sort of what you do when you ask people to be appreciative, etc., and what you appreciate about others. So part of it was serving as a mirror that reflected back not someone who couldn't be in society, but someone who could organize their thoughts and could be, in essence, quote, sane. So we lose that. But there's a period of time it was successful. So what you start to see here today isn't brand new. It's been done before. But we lose that because they end up as dumping grounds, and then the United States becomes under the influence of eugenics. You all know what eugenics is. Eugenic ideas are that some people have better genes than others. It happens. It's a cousin of Darwin who comes up with this idea. And once we come under the influence of eugenics, what do we say? Some people are better than others. We're just going to rank people, and who's seen as the worst? It's the mad. And we start hearing about how they're a threat to society. They're going to pass on their bad genes. The idea became that the mad insanity was a heritable disease, and it was a recessive disorder. So am I going to get this right? Yeah. You could get the insanity gene from your mother, the normal gene from your father, and you would not be insane, but you'd be a carrier. Okay? Now this was promoted by scientists at Ivy League schools, and they even had fairs where they would go to the state fairs or the county fairs, and American Eugenics Society would set up exhibits showing that this mode of insanity, and then they'd have blinking lights like a crazy person is born every 11 minutes, that sort of thing. So under the influence of that idea that insanity is an inherited disorder, the idea was you had to prevent them from breeding. It means they're a threat to society. So think of the flip from the York era. Rather than brethren, they're now a threat. And they have to be sterilized, and they don't have worth. They become useless eaters. And by the way, the first idea of killing the mentally ill, euthanasia, actually started in the United States. Of course, in Nazi Germany, that's where the Holocaust begins with the killing of the mentally ill. But the point is we went into a very dark era, okay, when they were seen as worthless. Now, modern era. I had no idea what I was going to say, by the way. I just got like going down to moral therapy. Anyway, if you look at the modern era, it unfolds in two parts. The first part is from 1955 really to 1980. 1955 is when we get Thorazine into asylum medicine. It's called the first antipsychotic drug. And in conventional histories of psychiatry, it is said this is the start of a psychopharmacological revolution, a great leap forward in care, okay? And there was a report by the U.S. Surgeon General in 1998 said before we had antipsychotics, people became chronically ill, and now we had these drugs that made it possible for people to live fairly well in the community. That was the story. however, and so we begin using antipsychotics. They're used in asylum medicine. They're used in high doses, etc. That actually helps create the first psychiatric survivor movement because so many people don't like the drugs, etc. But at this time, we still had a different philosophy of being because in the 50s and 60s and 70s, you still had a lot of Freudian impulses. And so there was still this thought that we humans struggled with our minds. We weren't just chemical beings. So you sort of had the use of drugs combined with Freudian ideas. And the Freudian ideas at least didn't separate, quote, them from us so strongly, right? Because the idea was we all struggled with our ego, superego, etc. Then 1980 comes. And 1980 is a big paradigm shift. Because what happens in 1980, and this is where we're going to come to you in not too long, in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association, which in the 70s had felt that as a profession, its legitimacy was being attacked. There were movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. In academia, there was anti-psychiatry movement actually coming from the academy. There were psychiatric survivors. And there were insurance companies saying, we don't really believe in the talk therapy you do. And there was a big fight for patients as well. Should you go to a psychiatrist? Should you go to a psychologist? Should you go to a social worker? So psychiatry as a profession said, our very legitimacy is being threatened. And they come up with, they say to themselves, how can we restore our legitimacy in society? And they said, who has great prestige in society? It's the doctor in the white coat. So they said, literally, you can read in their documents, they said, we need to put on a white coat for society. And what do doctors do? They treat diseases. So we're going to adopt a disease model for categorizing psychiatric distress. And so what you see in 1980, they published the third edition of their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, they call it the adopting a medical model. It's not. It's a disease model. We're going to call these things diseases of the brain, and we're going to say schizophrenia is as different from bipolar as, cardiovascular disease is from, renal disease or something. All these things are going to be discrete disorders, and they're going to be genetic, and then we very quickly hear that these things are due to chemical imbalances in the brain. So schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine, depression is due to too little serotonin, and then we hear we have drugs that fix those chemical imbalances, like insulin for diabetes. Now that story is a story of incredible medical advances. Think about this. You've identified the very molecule that causes, quote, madness, depression, and you can fix it? And given how complex the human brain is, if that's true, that's the greatest discovery in, I would say, ever. Certainly in medicine. And our society organized ourselves around that story. Okay? It was promoted to us. And then we had all these campaigns. Disorders were underdiagnosed and undertreated, and we get this expansion of the psychiatric enterprise. Remember Prozac? Those of you who are old enough to remember, Prozac comes to market in 1987. It's seen as a breakthrough medication, a wonder pill. It makes you better than well. Anyway, this kicks off this explosion. Okay. And by 2005, something like 87% of Americans know that depression is due to low serotonin, and similar know that schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine. So we organize ourselves around that narrative. And here's the problem. It's a false narrative. It's not true. They don't know the causes of these things. They never found that the molecules that were behind whatever these were. And the drugs, rather than fix a known pathology, actually cause the very imbalance they say is the problem in the first place. That's actually what was happening in the scientific literature. You didn't hear about it, right? We organized ourselves around the false narrative, and it expanded. You were asking, something like 1 in 5 Americans now takes a psychiatric drug on a daily basis. You go to our colleges, entering freshmen, it's 25 to 30% will be taking a medication when they arrive and have a diagnosis. This is an extraordinary expansion. And now so this begins in 1980, right? This story. It's 2019. Here's what we know about the story now. It's a false story. That's the first thing. They didn't discover these things. Second thing is, all the public health markers for mental, the burden of mental health in our society have gone way, way up. So as we've organized ourselves around this story, rather than being better at helping people get through a depressive episode or a psychotic episode, things have gotten worse. And how about schizophrenia? We have laws now, you're supposed to take your drugs, right? Do you know since 1995, you know what the recovery rate is for people diagnosed with schizophrenia? Studies show in Western countries. Anybody guess? What's the recovery rate? 6%. It's the worst in the history since the diagnosis was constructed. It's worse than it was in the first third of the 20th century. It was worse than it was in 1955. It's worse from when it was 1955 to 1995. It's the worst ever. Now, real quickly going forward, where were we at? We've now had the study that began to really turn this around, say, our thinking, at least in research circles, was a study done by Martin Harold, Thomas Jobe at the University of Illinois. Going back to the 70s, early 80s, they conduct a long-term study of the outcomes of 200 mostly first episode patients treated at 2 Chicago area hospitals, one public, one private, and they're just going to see how they do over time. Okay? Everybody's treated in the hospital with drugs. They're discharged, and they're going to see how they're doing at 2, 4.5, 7.5, 10, and 15 years, 20 years. And their thought, their hypothesis is those who take themselves off medication will do horribly. We're going to find them homeless. They're going to be psychotic. This is going to prove that long-term medication use is helpful. And what did they find? Exactly the opposite. So at the end of 2 years, of the 200, there were 64 people diagnosed with schizophrenia. About 25 of the 64 had taken themselves off. So they weren't helped, they took themselves off, okay? It's a naturalistic study. And at 2 years, those who are off and those who are on, there's not much difference in recovery rates. There's it's probably, what is it? I don't know, it's not that different. What you see in the study, though, is what happens between year 2 and 4.5. The off-med group gradually gets better, such that by the end of 4.5 years, 40% are in recovery versus 5% of those who are medication compliant. And that difference in recovery rate stays through the 15 years. By the way, those who get off and stabilize have almost no relapses in this study. Okay? This, in 2008, Martin Harold stood up before the American Psychiatric Association and said, I conclude, this is funded by the NIMH, best long-term study we've ever had. I conclude that people diagnosed with schizophrenia who are off their medications long-term have significantly better global outcomes. We don't hear that, do we? No. We never hear this. You probably won't also hear about World Health Organization studies that found outcomes much better in poor countries where they're not medicating people long-term. Anyway, since that, and by the way, he also had milder psychotic disorders. Those off medication did much, much better. The most amazing thing from Harold's study is schizophrenia patients off medication did better than those with milder disorders who stayed on medication through the time. So they had a more severe illness in the beginning, but they ended better than off. So people said, this can't be true. Well, we've now had about 5, 6 other long-term studies, other countries. There's been one from Norway. We have the WHO studies. There's been one from Denmark. We have one from Finland. We have one from Australia. Every study comes up with the same finding, that if you want to maximize the possibility of someone recovering, you've got to have a system of care that tries to minimize long-term use of antipsychotics. That doesn't mean there's no place for the drugs, especially over short term, but that's what science is telling us. It's doing it over and over again. And by the way, even the biological guys are now admitting in the United States, we have no evidence that antipsychotics improve long-term outcomes. But you don't hear that. Now, one final thing. You talked about, Beatrice, when people said, I don't want to be on these drugs. So there's been a big survey of recovered people diagnosed with schizophrenia. Here's what they said about the drugs. This was just published not a long time ago. Some of us found it helpful to be on the meds initially. Stabilized us, helped us go to sleep, whatever. But they said being on the drugs long term didn't allow us to marshal our resources, our emotional resources, our cognitive resources that we needed to get our lives back. because we were too numbed out. And there's studies showing that there is cognitive dampening with the use of the drugs. So now, here we are at inner fire. The intellectually, that disease model has failed, and it's acknowledged. The chemical imbalance has failed. People are admitting that they never validated the DSM-3 as discrete disorders. There's a way you validate. In other words, when we talk about schizophrenia, bipolar, there's ways in medicine you say this diagnosis has validity, and they'll admit now they didn't validate these disorders, they're constructs. So intellectually, if you go into the research literature, they'll admit the 1980 disease model failed, but we're still practicing it. It still governs our care. The practices that developed under that model is what governs our care. It governs our laws, it governs how we reimburse people, etc. So what we're at, I think, is we're at a moment of a possible paradigm shift. There's a group in northern Finland that, going back to the 1990s, they developed something called open dialogue, where they minimized long-term use of antipsychotics. And of their patients, where they minimized long-term use, if you look at their first episode patients, 80% are working or back in school at the end of 5 years and not psychotic. Do you think we get 80% recovery rates? Not close. So right now, there are these little seeds out there where people are trying to do things differently. And inner fire is one of the most prominent ones trying to do things differently. And here's the thing. So I run this web zine called Mad in America. I get emails all the time, almost every day. Where can I send my kid where they can get off meds? Or maybe a loved one or whatever. They've been on 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And I say, I don't know. I don't know. This big country, and I say, I don't know. I'll say, inner fire, and they'll say, how much it cost? And I say, I don't know. But I don't think, I know they have to charge, and so many people don't have the money, as you know. But every day I get this, people desperate for a place to go, and that's what you have here. But what you have here is not just for 26 seekers. It's an example of a different way, a paradigm shift. And I really think, just like if we go back to 1792 when the York Quakers said there's a better way, that's the moment now. And if you think it's just me talking, there's a guy named Danius Puris. He is the UN rapporteur for health. And he's a psychiatrist from, is he from the Ukraine? I'm not, Eastern Europe. I forget where he's from. He has called for a revolution in psychiatry. In the paper, he says, the biological model has failed. We need to rethink this. We need to rethink it about human rights. We need to reconceptualize it, not as people who are diseased, but as people who are struggling, like we all can struggle. And then he's basically saying, what do we all need to stay well? What do you need to stay? What do I need to stay well? Well, I need food. I need shelter. It really helps to have someone to love or someone to love you, to have meaning in life. I actually believe nature is very healing. So in other words, what do we, instead of thinking of a disease model, you start to say, what is a way to healing, staying well? And obviously that's what you're adopting here. So what I'm trying, final thing is this, is y'all should be very proud. Inner fire has a prominence, a place in the sort of national dialogue, even international dialogue now, when people are looking to do something profoundly different. And so what happens here, and when we hear the stories of people here, will have influence in that larger societal discussion of what's possible. And I think what you're creating here is such a beautiful possibility. You just need to, we need to find ways to offer it to more and more people. So anyway, thank you.
Well, after that inspiring sharing, it's quite extraordinary. You think the things we just take for granted, and then when one looks at the research and has it shared, and you just realize we're being sold a bill of goods, and there's a chance to make that different. So I hope some of you if not all of you, can stay just to have a look at what this actually looks like when you create a place for healing as well. I hope there might be some of you who are inspired to help make this come about. As Tom mentioned, we're trying to raise the additional funds now to build the west wing to match the east wing, and the center core where there'll be a big kitchen and a place where instruction can happen. Not to mention the arts barn, that will happen as well too. But I want to thank you all for coming. I was afraid we were going to be up to our ankles in mud, and it turned out that we got this beautiful day after all as well. Yeah. I wonder if there might be time for some questions then?
Mr. Whitaker, I wonder if you would feel like making any comments regarding the influence causing the resistance to the changes. I mean, perhaps the pharmaceuticals or the insurance companies and so forth.
There's a lot of resistance, of course. It's more complicated than I think we think. Basically, you create a system, right? It's like a huge ship. It's hard to turn that ship because so many people are invested in doing it in that way. And they're invested in it because that's what they do. They're invested in it because they've done it before. They don't want to think what they've done is harmful. And then, yeah, you have of course, pharmaceutical influences. They created a just think about this. They managed to turn 1 out of every 5 Americans into a regular consumer of psychiatric drugs. So that's what corporations do. They try to build markets. They try to build, So they did this very successfully. The American Psychiatric Association, as a guild, is invested in it as well. And part of the reason is they gave up talk therapy, counseling, to the psychologists, to the social workers. And they said, we'll be psychopharmacologists, right? You all heard this. Well, it's hard for them to say maybe the drugs are doing more harm than good, because that's like General Motors saying, if you buy my car, it might work for about 6 months and then the engine's going to blow up. They can't do it. So, and there's all sorts of cognitive dissonance that just, they don't want to hear this. So you have systems set up to do this. You have laws to do this. You have a public that was trained to think this way. Okay? You see it in our laws, etc. So it's hard when you get a narrative, right? When you get a narrative in place and you organize yourself around the narrative, and that's what you do, it's hard to move out of that narrative. It just is. You've got laws, practices, careers built on it. But narratives do shift. Paradigm shift. And what's really, I think, setting the stage for this paradigm shift now, this narrative has obviously failed. It hasn't failed on a public health level. In other words, we haven't reduced the burden of these disorders. Outcomes are terrible. Basically, everybody acknowledges people are dying early. They're not working. Our disability numbers have soared. Our disability numbers went from 1.2 million people adults on disability in 1987 when Prozac came to market. We're over 5 million on disability due to mental disorders now. So you have this increased spending, you have these poor outcomes, you have people who develop all sorts of other physical complications, and partly the reason is within psychiatry they'll admit they didn't validate the disorders, they didn't find the chemical imbalance, they don't have evidence they're improving long-term outcomes. So their evidence base has collapsed. So you have the momentum of the ship, but you don't have the philosophy or the evidence, which does open up other possibilities. And we're talking, for example, Beatrice and I were talking when I first came. If you could do a study where you could compare not just the cost now, but let's say you have someone come to Inner Fire, okay? And they stay here a year, whatever that cost is. And then 5 years later, they're working. They're a taxpayer. I don't want to put everything in cost, but you know what I mean. Now they're the taxpayer. Look at the spending on that person up front for 1 year versus having someone for forever as a mental patient, which is what's happening. And by the way, I was out at Kaiser Permanente once. You can't believe the medical expenses that come with being a psychiatric patient. So somehow, if we could even have that sort of study where we look at what happens 5 years with costs, and I hate to say that, but this runs things. So you need to do a study of what happens to your seekers 5 years out. But go ahead.
That just connects with my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Like, why wouldn't insurance companies want to support those programs which are more effective and actually are, cost efficient in the long term?
So I've asked that question. Insurance companies aren't really motivated to save money. They're not. You think they are, but they're not, because basically insurance companies get a percentage of the total amount spent, right? If you look at the total amount spent, they basically carve out whatever it might be, 15, 18%. You spend more, you get more. I'm not kidding.
You're talking about the leadership or the CEOs getting.
Yeah, the people that organize the providers, or the insurance companies themselves. Whether the more you spend, the more they make in a way, not the individuals. So there's no cost-saving thing really pressure on the insurance companies themselves. And if we had a system that tried to say to be fiscal, put an incentive to be fiscally responsible, of course they'd cut back on this. When I was out in Kaiser, they were doing a study about, a very simple study. They looked at people who come in and use an antidepressant for the first time, okay? Now they have how much money they're taking from health insurance in the previous 5 years, okay? So they know their level of use. It's like this, it's going around like this. They have an antidepressant, whoop, goes up like this on the meds. So it's not just the cost of the medication, but they have all these other sort of problems. So you say to them, well, shouldn't you maybe limit the antidepressants? They weren't, no, that's what the patients want, that's what we get paid for. They didn't even they wouldn't even publish that information. So that I think is the answer. There's just not the fiscal incentive.
And I think also, just to add, Robert, that we had a seeker here who she was off her medication and she still needed support with this. She needed disability until she got her feet under her. The insurance company refused to give her disability unless she was on medication. It's remarkable, and I do want to stress that somehow it's like we don't take no for an answer. Like, we have a seeker fund, and there's no way at all that we need to be dependent on insurance companies. We can't be. We have to raise the money. We have to keep this fund alive and active. And I really am hoping to, well, I'm sort of gearing up to approaching the Department of Mental Health here in Vermont. I say, you support 5 people a year for 5 years. Tom being an economist, I've learned to talk money in that sense, but they'll be off their disability. They'll be off their psychotropic meds. Most important, they'll be reclaiming their lives. And one day they will be tax-paying citizens. And we are less than a third of what people spend a day at the retreat. That's over $1,000 a day. And we're at the moment, we've had to raise our cost to $425. It's too much. But as one parent said, you get so much more for your money at Inner Fire with the therapies and the work program and the food and beauty. And maybe Robert's sitting here, I'd like you all to meet Robert, who, when you go into the East Wing, you'll see the beautiful color work he's done. He's a Lazur artist, and he has really helped to create this simple home into a gem to feed the souls of the seekers.
Beatrice, can I add one thing here? There was an experiment in the 70s that was the Satyria experiment, so that was that we can do things with the environment. And one of the things they found, though, once they left the house, they needed support. And they needed to keep the connections. You can't just leave them and throw them off into the, that was really key there.
And what we have tried to do, we did it this year and it didn't work. But we have always planned to have what's called a creative living community, not a halfway house. But all the people who have learned to be creative here, we need to find someone who will buy a house in Brattleboro and not be dependent on how many seekers come or go, right? And our folks can go from here to there, stay within striking distance, still work with Edel or Ian or Bob, one of the craftspeople, and also Patty's going to start working with one of our seekers with bookbinding and embroidery and this sort of thing. And so that because they've developed connections. Our seekers have done restorative justice. One has worked with the Stonewall Trust. They do kindergartens, they do creative things here. And many of them don't want to go home. They're not ready yet for that. One day they may, you know. So we need this creative living community as a stepping stone. And we have Joyce, who's here, somewhere here, who's our transition guide, who helps people make the steps they need to take to, yeah. So there's a lot more. We've come a long ways. There's still a long ways to go. But
I'm just wondering if you're aware, I have worked as a psychiatric RN since 1988, so I've seen all of this, you know, starting with 88 was right after Prozac was introduced, and I've seen the burgeoning of medication and all that it does and all of that. But I'm wondering if you are aware, because I think you're uniquely positioned, is there curiosity, is there any movement from within the system, you know, of people who are prescribing, who want to, I know of Fran, I don't remember her last name, in Burlington, Vermont.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
there's some, but what's happening in the system of people moving away from the meds?
I've had the opportunity to give a fair number of grand rounds, which means you're speaking to residents, and believe it or not, this is almost unbelievable. But at Temple Medical School, they've been bringing me back every year, so I've been with the residents. They actually made me a member of their adjunct faculty. I think the guy must be crazy or whatever. The point is, the residents today are open to new ideas. Because they're not invested in the old model like the guys that made their career out of this and became famous guys, etc. So they're ready to be different. And so many people who are, you know, residents who pick psychiatry are wonderful human beings. They're really caring people. I mean, sometimes they want to help people, and they're willing to be with people in distress and all that sort of thing. Because it's hard, of course. But then they enter the system and they get chewed up. They don't know how to practice because there's no really place to practice in this way. And then if they don't prescribe, who are they going to work for? So there's actually sort of a despair among a lot. And so if you look at who's going into psychiatric residencies, they're avoiding it now by the droves. Because they really don't want to get involved in a failed paradigm of care. The people I know at Temple Medical School, so I've sort of known them now, they've gone through this and all. They're lovely, lovely people. And they work with the population in North Philadelphia that is so troubled. But they're graduating and they say, I don't know where to go. Because I apply and they're not going to support me for taking people off medications. So that's the problem. You got to build so the good news is there's a younger generation I do think want to do something different. The question is, can you create places that they can create, place to treat people they want to? In Norway, by the way, now there's a government initiative requiring hospitals to have medication-free wards. Okay, that's a government mandate, and there's a new hospital that started open that doesn't use any meds for psychiatric patients. They'll taper them off, but that's the whole goal. That creates a place for people to practice safely. And by the way, for example, in Norway, once they started this, they have something called basal exposure therapy, not important. They're taking chronic patients, and about 5 years out, they're on 6 meds, that sort of thing. They've been hospitalized multiple times. So I think 15 out of the first 34 are now off all meds, working out of the system. And these are chronic patients. But they're now in a system that supports that.
So Norway. Well, that's a start.
Yeah, Norway's a battle like you can't believe. The psychiatric establishment is fighting back.
Oh, I'm sure.
But one of the things that it has in Norway is they have this government which really listens to the people. It's built into the system. And so basically the survivors force this issue. And they're the ones who create it. But it's because of a political system that actually, if you have a hospital, you have to have patient representatives on your sort of governing board or something. Just like the United States today.
Question over here.
Sort of a rhetorical question, and one that requires, I think, longer conversation. I know many people, both parents and their children, that are on psychotropics, and they hate it. I mean, that's the first thing they admit. I also know people, in my industry, essentially, that have financial resources. One of the things that I am challenged with is, how do I talk intelligently to these people about what, for example, Inner Fire is doing? When I mention the concept, everybody is, wow, that's fantastic. But I'd love to be able to figure out the tools in conversation to take it to the next step, whether that person can be approached from, the intellectual scientific study perspective, or more of the heart forces realm, if you will. But I'd love to, I'm wanting sort of a guidebook on how, especially for parents and who themselves are on psychotropics and their children who are on psychotropics, and they are terrified of saying no. How can I, as the layperson, bring this?
So I run this website called madinamerica.com. And one of the purposes of the website is actually to make easily available the research that actually shows that this existing paradigm isn't what you think it is. In other words, that if you can begin with the common thing, do you believe in evidence? Do you believe in the scientific research? Done not by people like Beatrice or Tom, but by people at Harvard Medical School, the believers. And then, so for example, we just put up all this research. And so, for example, now we have a parent resources section. And in there, you can go on and you can do drugs, antidepressants, and look at all the research related to how antidepressants affect kids. It's a horrible thing. And then we also have on this site alternatives to antidepressants for kids. We do it for psychotic disorders. We do it for ADHD. And you can actually run down that literature pretty fast, and we're building that for adults as well. So from my point of view, what Mad in America is trying to do is to say, okay, you guys believe in evidence-based medicine. That's what they always say. So let's look at what the evidence says. And let's include long-term outcomes. And so to engage them on the turf that they say they believe in, as opposed to how about a humanistic vision? Because if you engage with them on their turf and show that the evidence shows really you're not doing well long-term, that opens up the door for a conversation. And I don't know how else to open the door.
So, is Inner Fire keeping the information that would be useful in making these cases in the future? And how many people do you need to have go through the program before your findings are statistically valid?
Well, we've had about 26 people go through the program. Now, it's an interesting dynamic because for some people, they are so glad to be off their meds, and they disappear. They get on with life, they disappear. They don't, and of course, I would love to hear from them. I'd love them to come back and visit and this sort of thing, and there's some who do. But there are a lot of people who, when they go, we actually, I was sort of thinking, can we have them sign on the dotted line? Please be in touch with us. Let us know how you're doing. But we haven't got that, to answer your question, we haven't got that research going yet.
Can I jump in on this?
Yes,
Because this is a great question. So Martin Harrow, he's the one who did that 20-year study. He was able to keep track of 77% of his people that entered the study, which is unbelievable across 20 years in the United States. And so he wasn't the caregiver, he was the researcher. And what he found is by keeping up with their addresses, first of all, he found out the people who got off meds and did well, they disappeared from the system. They didn't want anything to do with psychiatry. The psychiatrist didn't see them. They disappeared. But he managed to keep them up And they were actually very happy to participate in the study in this sort of like outside psychiatry realm. They were no longer psychiatric patients, they were working or whatever. So somehow here at Interfire, now remember they had 200, which is a lot better than 26, and they also had mostly first episode. You need a researcher from the outside who makes it their duty to sort of make connections with them. Maybe Harold would give them a card each year saying, hey, how you doing? And they were happy to participate, but they didn't want anything to do with psychiatry. So they wanted to be, I'm done with that. That's one of the things that Harold found. I'm with you. You need to find research on this. Yeah.
I would just like to say quickly, as a board member, that's one of the things we've been talking about at the board, because we know how critical it is as we move forward, because that is what people are looking for. That's what funders are looking for. That's what grants are looking for. So it's definitely on the list, and any help for that would be great.
It's also what society is looking for.
Yes, in society.
I guess my comment is that all politics are local, and we are in Vermont. If we were having this discussion right now, let's say before the leadership in the White House, I can't even imagine what the response would be. But one of the voices that's incredibly important in Vermont is the voice of patients, consumers, family members, advocates, and others. And I'll just relate this story. In 1984, I was involved with the Mental Health Association, which I directed for 30 years. In 1984, I drafted a bill that would somewhat improve coverage for mental health conditions. At that point, 1984 up until 1997, you had a lifetime limit of $10,000 in your mental health coverage. The best policy by Blue Cross Blue Shield was $10,000. And even back then, $10,000 meant that you were on the brink of financial disaster should you be facing this issue. And I particularly worked with a young legislator from Burlington who was new enough not to know how impossible this seemed. And we were laughed out of committee when you said we weren't even talking about equalizing coverage, we were wanting to change it from $10,000 to $100,000 lifetime. And it didn't go anywhere, but we kept working on it, and we kept making linkages with other groups, and particularly folks who had experienced mental health issues. Some were in recovery, some were still challenged, some never got well, but we were able to organize. And in 1997, we presented a bill that talked about equalizing coverage for mental health and substance abuse in Vermont. And we became the first state when the representative who I'd worked with initially, his name was Howard Dean, and he had become governor. And the end of the story is that when the hearings took place during the whole winter and the session, I asked all those who supported the bill not to have any professional or any academic testify. But in 1997, only folks who experienced mental health issues, either as a consumer, a patient, whatever term you want to use, family members, and others who were advocates to testify. And that had a tremendous impact in passing the bill. And Interfire can't do everything, but it can take that model, and other groups can pick up with it and say, it may have taken 10 or 11 years to get that passed, but Vermont became really the first state to equalize coverage for mental health and substance abuse. And it may take that long to get support for some of what's happening here.
Well, Ken, in our first year, we had the Department of Mental Health sent me an email saying, we hear wonderful things about Interfire, can we come visit? And I sort of thought, oh, all right, come along, And they were so impressed. And the man said to me, and he came with a woman, said, between you and me, we don't know what we're doing, and the meds are not working. And they asked me to then speak with the medical director of the new hospital in Berlin. And when I spoke with her and her entourage, at the end she said, this is ideal, this sounds ideal. I said, yes, and it's hard work. But I want to come back, and so now I'm getting ready, and maybe you can help me or whatever, but I want to approach the state, or I want to approach, they say, when I mentioned we want support to be a pilot project, they say, well, there's no money. I say, well, we're less. You spend so much money, and we're much less. And so, let's see, where was I going with that? But I want to, so we'll see. But I want to give a picture. There's a man who's maybe in his mid-30s from Vermont, who I met at this rehab where I worked. Before I went there, I met with one of their staff who told me about the 5 people I was going to start working with. And they said this one particular man has an IQ of a 5 to 7-year-old, which I never pay any attention to. I'll say, we'll see. Right? We start working, we have the most profound conversations. He's actually treated as an intelligent human being, and he responds. He knows how to play the game, and if no one's going to expect I'm intelligent, well, why even bother? He'd been in the system long enough. And he came in one day, and he's a big guy, and he was sort of pushing the furniture around as he came in. And he said, it's as if I've got all these feelings inside me, and I can't reach them. And I used to be able to think clearly, but I can't anymore. It's as if the meds have pushed who I really am under the table. And I said to him, I agree with you. And he looked at me and he said, nobody for 12 years has ever agreed with me. Oh. And so he was just medicated, and he never missed an artistic therapy session. And the beauty of the artistic therapy is that you're tapping into the creator within the individual. Then you back off. You find which medium they connect with, and then they begin to experience themselves in a totally different way. And so one day he comes in and he plunks down at the table, and I say, what's up? And he said, the doctor changed my meds. We had been working for about 1.5 years, and I nearly burst into tears of either anger or sadness. I'm not sure. I still don't know today what they were, but I was so, because this man was jogging. He was changing. The case manager said, we haven't seen him like this before, and so on and so on. And I said, well, what meds are you taking? And he said, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? I speak rather directly with the folks I work with. What do you mean you don't know? And he said, I hate being medicated, and nobody listens to me. My parents don't listen to me. My case manager doesn't listen to me. My psychiatrist doesn't listen to me. So the easiest thing to do is to take the meds. And his story was this. Very wealthy family, very nasty divorce, just as he goes off to college. The rug's pulled out from under his feet. He doesn't know what to do. He hasn't really lived life because he's been protected because of the money picture and all this sort of thing. So he latches onto a young woman, a freshman also. And it's okay for a little while, but then it gets too intense, and she says, I don't want to see you anymore. And and that's his story. Now, is he mentally ill? Does he just need help learning how to deal with your parents divorcing and who you are inside, and what do we do? But it's much easier to not say to the parents, get your act together because your kids are really suffering, or whatever it is. I mean, that sounds a bit harsh, but we blame the child and we medicate the child. And what healthy child should sit behind a desk for 6 hours a day? Any child who reacts against it is a real child. Right? But they're medicated. Start with Ritalin. I mean, it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. But I just wanted to say, when we talk about mentally ill, let's go deeper for their sake, for respect for them. What's your story? As Peter Bregan says, once you start medicating, you're no longer interested in the person's story. But we're human beings together. And we need each other. That's the truth of it, you know. So George.
So would this be a time as well, maybe ask the last question and then offer people a chance to see?
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Well, it's just a comment. I work with our local community mental health agency, and I have to say that unfortunately the reality that the billing documentations that are required to generate the revenue are based on medical necessity and all of those pieces. And yet what you are doing here in Inner Fire is so transformative. I mean, you're taking the soul and the spirit and community and connection and relationships and really helping change people in such significant ways that if we could reconcile that with the reality of what we know are the outcomes so that people can transform and change, the costs are, all that will fall in line. $2,700 a day for the state hospital in Berlin, $1,600 a day
and
for the retreat. And this is not a reflection of those institutions, and yet it is a system that is built on a narrative and one wonders where that narrative, how do you reconcile that with the soul and the spirit and the things that I've seen that I get and I understand, and I see that you are absolutely making real every day. And so it's finding a way to make that. And I do think the voices of the people, of the seekers and the family members and so many people that are connected are very powerful. And I think we are fortunate that we are in Vermont and not in other places. And yet we also can learn from the folks across the way and remember. So anyway, I just want to make that comment. Thank you.
Could you imagine inviting people?
A tour, yes. So there's Joyce can show people, or you can just look around. There are a couple of things just to point out in this building, and Andy McPhail there in the back, he's responsible. And I want to just mention this little story. We sing every morning at Inner Fire, and I had the bright idea as they started to work up here, and they really told me they loved working up here.
We did.
So, so I remember Andy driving by one morning. I stopped him. I said, Andy, what if we all sing together? What if the Seekers and we come up and we sing with you guys up there? And Andy is very tactful, and he has this little look of surprise and then this little wry smile. And he says, well, all right, So we did. So we came up and we sang a few times together, and it was very funny because the electrician, and I saw only his back saying, I don't sing. But it was, but inside you'll see, I mentioned the stained glass windows. There are a couple of rooms that have them. The Seekers have taken the other ones back, and there's one Seeker who's working on one now. And the idea of that is, as you have your liver compress, which is strengthening your liver, you can look through the beauty of the stained glass that you did. And I remember one Seeker who was very quiet as I was driving him to Putney, where Edel works. And I wasn't quite sure why you're so quiet. And on the way back, he said, that wasn't half so bad as I imagined. He had never done anything like this before, and he was so scared to do this. So all sorts of things, and oftentimes the craftspeople become mentors. And then you'll see also outside each bedroom, there's a shelf. And on Sundays, the Seekers, whether it's the winter or any time of year, you go out and you pick your bouquet. And it could be, and it's wonderful, the diversity. Someone might just have one flower and a stone, or some may be abundant, but basically it helps you to look out into nature. And I remember in the winter people saying, I never knew how much color there was in winter. So that was cool. And you'll see odd things about it. We used a lot of the wood locally, so it's rough. The bed legs are tree trunks. Anything that will sort of kindle wonder or curiosity or whatever. And you'll see Robert's each room is different. And So one of our seekers said, yes, you can go in my room. Another seeker said, no, I want my room. So we honor that. And then you're welcome to wander down here through the healing herbs garden we have. And one day we wanted cottage industry, and the seekers can learn to run a business, then make the ointments and the tinctures and so. And we have a hoop house, which our first group of seekers, a woman from Detroit, inner city Detroit, was the one who put the spade in the earth first time to begin digging this hoop house, which now we've been serving. And we have a chicken coop also. That's the most recent building project on wheels. So we have, and one day we'll clear the woods over there on the other side of Brook and have goats and milk goats. So step by step. And thank you all for coming and daring, even with the torrential rain this morning. It was thank you. You know. But so have a look and wander, and if we can answer any questions, we're glad to. So at Inner Fire, we recognize people as whole human beings, which means they have a body, a soul, and a spirit. And within the soul, they have what could be referred to as an etheric, a life body, and also an astral body. The etheric body is where rhythm, memories live, habits live, and the astral body, you could say, is at the seat of our emotions. So we take this into account in creating the whole program. And so out of form comes freedom is one of our mottos. So a very important aspect of the program for all of the seekers who come here is the rhythm, the order of the day. They know they get up at 6:45. We have breakfast at 7. 7:30 we wash up. And then at 8 o'clock we go for a walk, get out despite the weather, and come on back. And then we have what we call the morning circle, which is a time where we share what we're grateful for and how we're doing. And then the out-breath aspect of the community, of the experience at Inner Fire begins, and that's where you do something for the community. So that means you either work in the garden, or you split wood, or chop down a tree and split the wood, or you do the house cleaning with biodegradable cleansers, or you help in the kitchen and help prepare the midday meal and the soup and salad for supper. Then after lunch, you have a rest every day of the week, and 3 days you have what's called a liver compress, which is a way of strengthening the liver so that it can better do its job in detoxing. And then in the afternoons, there are therapies, artistic therapies, music therapy, speech arts, eurythmy, spatial dynamics, different forms, and artistic therapy. Then one has supper, and then the evening activities can differ. An appreciation evening, sharing a question, singing together. And the whole program is helping the soul to breathe again, because when we have trauma in our life, there are different ways to respond. Sometimes it's in getting caught in what I refer to as the in-breath, where we're afraid of breathing out for fear of falling apart. Or let's say somebody's been sexually abused. They want to get outside this body. They want to get as far out of the body as possible. And if you lose your center, then of course, you can begin to hear voices. So at Inner Fire, we're working all the time on the in-breath and the out-breath, bringing rhythm to the breathing again, and bringing balance to the soul. And we also remind people that everybody has what I would call the divine creative self, a part of themselves that's never wounded, that's never hurt, but that's more objective. It's the observer. There's another part of us, of course, on the soul level, the astral level, which constricts, suffers, feels pain. And I'd say one of the other things that happens at Inner Fire from day one is building up the etheric, the life body, the rhythm body again, and that also means changing habits. We have a habitual way of thinking about ourselves, We have a habitual way of reacting. And so as people slowly, slowly and carefully taper from these mind-altering psychotropic medications, all the issues that could have been addressed if they had had the help in the first place, but instead they were just medicated, begin to express themselves, begin to come up. We can't hide them anymore. The meds typically dull us, disconnect us from our medication. Disconnect us through the medication from our feelings, our thinking, our ability to do. So we're helping the people to reclaim their lives. As I mentioned earlier, it's not mental illness, it's soul imbalance. We don't know how to deal with our traumas. And so it's typically a year program, because coming off your meds to do it safely and carefully takes time. It's hard work. I remind people this isn't a holiday camp, but you can reclaim your lives. And people who have come here have said this is the first place they have ever felt safe. There's no judgment. It doesn't matter what you've gone through in your life or what substances you've taken in your life. If you really want to heal yourself, we welcome you to come to Inner Fire. And I think, as I've also mentioned earlier, one of the most challenging issues is the financial issue. Inner Fire needs to be available for people regardless of their financial situation, regardless of their race, their religion, that it's a place where we meet in our humanity. And we have what we call a seeker fund. There's money out there. And there are many people who have lost children to suicide. We want to call upon people who will help another young person or middle-aged person reclaim their lives who don't otherwise have the money. And I think it's a long time coming before any insurance company will want to support us without strings attached. And with the strings, then we'd no longer have our program. And I'm very much hoping that the Inner Fire will be able to be used as a pilot project, and that 5 people a year from the state of Vermont are supported to come to Inner Fire. And they will be off their disability, off their psychotropic meds, reclaiming their lives, and one day tax-paying citizens. And the overhead costs are so much lower than in the state-run facilities. And we expect people to get well. We know people can get well. And we work with people who have attempted suicide, imagining that when they feel listened to, when they feel respected, that they will no longer feel they need to take their life. And they have a tremendous amount of support by the extraordinary guides that we have here at Inner Fire, who are so committed and so grateful to be able to work in a way that they believe. And when you know you're surrounded by people who believe in you, you can reclaim your life. And that's what Inner Fire is about. And it's a catalyst. We're being watched from all over the world. I'm told by parents there's no other organization like Inner Fire in the United States, which I would say is actually outrageous. I have no idea how that can be so, that there cannot be another place that can help you to come off your medication and help you to reclaim your life. But one thing I need to say is we don't fix anybody. Nobody's broken. And also you can have the best program in the world, but when people have said, this is as much as I can do for the time being, that's fine. But thus far we've had, I think everyone who has been here has felt really loved and respected and cared for. And if we can just draw money to support a seeker fund, then the voice of the people can speak up, and we can make Inner Fire available for people regardless of their financial situation. So the question of the experience of reclaiming our thinking and feeling as we taper from these mind-altering psychotropic meds. One of the first things people will say is, I can think clearer. Yeah. And that's very encouraging. They feel more themselves. But then there's the whole slew of emotions. And it can be that people feel anger that their parents didn't protect them, anger that they've lost so many years of their life. And so we do have an anger is okay, but violence is unacceptable. Yet sometimes we have violence, and we have to really work with that as creatively as possible. But there are all these feelings, but there's time to talk, and we sit in a group together. And when we have sharing a question one of the evenings, so someone can bring a question, what would you do in a situation like this? And it's very beautiful to see how we have the time, we make the time to talk, to listen, to share. Everybody has tear ducts. You know, we should use them sometimes. If you cry, we're not going to consider you mentally ill. And I think it's totally outrageous that apparently if you cry for more than 3 weeks at the loss of a loved one, you're considered depressed and you should be medicated. That's outrageous. I'll cry as long as I need to cry. And when I stop crying, I don't need to cry anymore. You know, but we've created a society in which everything is gray. There's a certain way to behave. Do this, do that, go through life gray. We can't. We're human beings. So it's a process, and it's an individual process, and that's another reason why I would say this is really a work of art. Helping people. You have wisdom behind you. You have insights, wisdom behind you. But every single person is different, and you need to call upon, you need to be an artistic person in yourself to be able to work with a person in this or that way, and to be flexible and to be creative. Yeah? And boundaries. The seekers need to learn boundaries in relation to family members or even each other, and we as guides need to learn boundaries, you know. So these are wonderful life skills that ideally we all would learn growing up in school, but I think we sit down behind the desk too much to learn to practice these social skills, you know. But so I think I can say in response to the question, everybody is unique. And some of the emotions that come up are bright, harsh, scary. And people learn to trust them, to work with them, to not be a victim of them, but most important, to claim them, to be able to say, I am so angry. I am so sad. It's okay. We're human beings, and we all have this spectrum in us. Yeah. Thank you.